Welcome back to We Play Games. I'm Walker, and here we are in CK3 After the End, about to discuss the lore and history of Tawantinsuyu and its immediate environs, and I'm entitling this The Empire in the Clouds. So for those of you who are really unfamiliar with this area, we're going to briefly discuss the terrain and the history. So here we have Cusco. Cusco is the ancient capital of the Inca Empire of Tawantinsuyu. This, in the indigenous tongues, means the land of the four quarters, land of the four corners. It's the name given to this empire by Pachacuti during his expansion. Cusco was a massive agricultural breadbasket. It really helped power the growth of the Inca Empire, but it sits at 11,000 feet. For those of you who have been to Denver and experienced altitude sickness, Cusco is literally twice as high. And then, of course, right next door, we have Machu Picchu. But how is it that these people ended up being conquered by the Spanish? How is it that these people ended up surviving in this really interesting terrain? How is it that these people have survived now until several hundred years after the event? I think before we discuss the people, though, we do need to discuss briefly the terrain. As we hinted in the intro to CK3 After the End South America video, there are a couple of really big and important terrain features in South America, and we are centered around two of them. We have the Andes Mountains, and we have the Atacama Desert. The Andes Mountains are the longest continental mountain chain in the world, and the Atacama Desert is the oldest desert and the driest non-polar desert in the world. The Atacama Desert, for instance, is actually the area that most people go to whenever they want to film Mars stuff, or if they want to test Mars equipment, because it's so dry. It's so dry because this is, of course, a giant mountain chain, and here we have an ocean. And so that ocean would naturally be pushing moisture towards the coast, and then it would bounce off of these mountains, and then rain would fall all over the place. And so we should have this really green, fertile slice here, and then an amazing stretch of desert. But instead, because of this anticyclone, there's a powerful force down here in the southern hemisphere that rotates counterclockwise, and it pulls cold, dry air out from Antarctica and pushes it along the western coast of South America. And that cold, dry air wedges right underneath the wet, hot air coming off of the Pacific and pushes it over the Andes Mountains and into the Amazon jungle. And so all that water ends up over here. 90% of the water coming off of the Pacific Ocean ends up on the east of the Andes Mountains, whereas only 10% stays on the west. And so that should highlight that this is really extreme terrain here. The people did manage to transform this area into an enormous agricultural breadbasket, though, utilizing terrace structures for their agriculture. And that sort of terrace farming still exists here in CK3 After the End. And for that matter, it still exists in the real world. So the Empire of Tawantinsuyu was one of the largest empires in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Spanish. By population, it may have had as many as 10 million citizens at one point. But then right towards the end, Huayna Capac, the Sapa Inca, died of a disease, probably smallpox, because there was a massive plague that swept through their empire, and it killed Huayna Capac and his chosen successor. And that left Atahualpa and Huáscar to fight out a bitter civil war between not only the two brothers, but also the power centers that had emerged in Quito, thanks to Huayna Capac building a new capital there, and the ancient capital of Cusco. And that brutal civil war destabilized the realm right at the time that the Spanish were following up, and they managed to find Atahualpa at the moment of his victory and captured him at an ambush, basically, and then they executed him. Francisco Pizarro and the Spanish, they chose a character named Manco Capac to become their figurehead, but ultimately Manco Capac did lead a rebellion, but it was unsuccessful, and he had to flee to Vilcabamba and fought basically a generation-long guerrilla campaign against the Spanish. But the Spanish were ultimately victorious, and they established a new capital down in Lima, because they didn't want to go all the way up here, despite the fact that Cusco had an incredible road network stretching out from it. Because of course it had an incredible road network, it had to. The logistics here are too complicated otherwise. But because of the extreme nature of the terrain, even though the empire may have been defeated, the people here were not. And so even into today, the Quechua language group families, Aymara families, these languages are still widely spoken. And it's just because it's so difficult for people who are not well fit to survive. And so we see a lot of the cultures in the game are going to actually have traditions that reflect the extreme nature of their terrain, either because they have a unique tradition or they have the normal traditions, or, both, as well as the widespread use of the Incaic legacy here. And then even stretching into the Atacama, of course, we see people well fit to survive in desert, because this is very extreme desert. But in addition to capturing the extreme nature of their terrain, I think that the cultures here in CK3 After the End also capture something interesting about the history of the people. So Tawantinsuyu, the land of the four corners, they operated basically de-economized. The state, air quotes, bought everything, and the people got all of the goods that they needed from the state, from state warehouses. The state operated and built an extensive road network and oversaw the transportation of goods and tribute all throughout the empire. And the people could get goods from the empire from just going up to their storehouses whenever they wanted to, but in exchange the people had to work on communal work projects, because that's how these things operated. In order to survive here, you need to be able to pool labor, because labor is going to be one of the most constraining resources if you're not cooperating, and you can't just rely on the land itself to provide for you. You have to build advanced terrace structures. You have to develop crops that operate well at specific altitudes, and you have to use all of the altitude of all of the land. If you've never tried to farm at 11,000 feet, I don't blame you. The way it really operates is that there's different bands of climate right along this mountain face. At the very highest, of course, it's mostly going to be fallow, it's going to be trees. And then right below that, you have a livestock ranch, an area that you can keep living animals on. Alpacas and llamas are very well suited to there. And then you have gradations of agriculture that you can do as you go down the side of the mountain. But in order to capture as much of the water here as they can, they built terrace structures, they're essentially dams, really, that helped capture rain and conserve water. They built massive road structures as well as those storehouses. And all that stuff meant that the state needed labor, people provided labor, and it was collectivized. Communal nature is here both in the Quechua as well as in the Aymara communal group. I think it's very flavorful that that's here in the game. I think it captures the spirit of the empire pretty well. I think if these guys weren't courtly, they should be communal, but I think having a communal courtly divide makes sense. But many of these cultures, in fact, virtually all of them, are going to reflect the extreme nature of their terrain and have at least one terrain tradition. And I think that makes sense, because this is some of the most important terrain in the world, and in order to survive on it, you do need to be well fit to it. And that's what has happened here. These indigenous people have survived, and they've reemerged and reestablished an empire. And so this lore might change, but I really do hope that this is the first civil war being fought in Tawantinsuyu since its reemergence, because that would put this real psychological terror cast over all of the characters, because anyone who's familiar with the history of what happened to the Sapa Inca probably knows that any civil war here, you're walking on a razor's edge. Right? And so that's what's going on here inside the empire, is a civil war. We have Empress Kusi II, a disputed heritage character. These seem to be randomly distributed except for Brave. And then Francisca, ambitious, trying to overthrow her sister, and an aunt on the outside, looking in with her insanely high intrigue stat, possibly trying to assassinate the sisters and become the ruler on her own. But while that might be a dynastic struggle that's going on inside the empire, the faiths and cultures surrounding it highlight that there's this simultaneous resurgence of indigenous peoples, while also reflecting the reality on the ground, that although indigenous people are thriving there even today, the Quechua language group, for instance, has 8 million speakers, as far as I know. But while the cultures and languages on the ground, even today, reflect the well-fitness of the indigenous people, or the religion of the area today, is largely Catholic. And so any sort of reemergence of Tawantinsuyu here in Crusader Kings 3 After the End, especially because this reemergence seems to have come in hand with the reemergence of the original Andean Inti faith, it's pretty clear that what happened is this empire reemerged, and the royal family practiced or observed the Inti faith, and probably utilized that as a source of legitimacy when it was reconquering. But of course, the Inti faith is not the predominant religion here in Peru or South America today. It's Catholicism. And I think that the way that the mod has handled this is really smart. So instead of just having some random form of Catholicism here, they've specifically designed a special, I apologize for my pronunciation, Hoihepunko church. This church actually shares the same head of faith with the Inti, the Wilak Umu. And they do that, of course, because at some point the Archbishop of Peru transferred his spiritual responsibilities to the refounded office of the Wilak Umu. So that means that there is actually a form of Christianity here in Peru and inside the borders of Tawantinsuyu, but it's a form of Christianity that is uniquely married to the Inti faith. That goes a lot further than just having a tenant, and I think is really cool. I think the fact that the mod has the ability to share heads of faith is something that they're doing a great job utilizing here. But it's not just one way, it's not just the Inti have subjugated the Hoihepunko church, but it seems as though the Inti faith has also changed in turn. So for those of you who are more familiar with the history of the Incan Empire of Tawantinsuyu prior to its collapse, you should be aware that A, incest marriage was allowed, and B, there was a predominant utilization of mummification to the point where mummified royal characters would still be given seats at court. But it seems as though both of those practices have kind of been swept under the rug. And I think that makes sense, because those would be the sort of things that, in order for the Archbishop of Peru to sign over his responsibilities, he may have demanded reforms of the Inti faith to line it up closer with Catholicism. I think that's really interesting if that's true. It could be that the mod team just wanted to highlight different things about the Inti faith, but I think especially the reliance on mummification and the veneration of those characters makes a lot of sense to be demanded to get rid of. But the religion here is not just the story of the Inti and the Hoihepunko. There's also this group, the Israelites. So the Israelites are like basically an apocalyptic cult, but it makes a lot of sense to me. They are locally here in the real world, but it's also an apocalyptic cult. And so in the event of an apocalypse, I feel pretty confident that apocalyptic cults will do pretty well. We also have liberationists or liberationism out here, which is a Christianity with an extreme focus on combating poverty, and Santa Diablada, which looks sort of like this area's version of voodoo, or really any sort of dualist faith. So one of the things that people often forget is that, yes, there are monotheistic faiths and polytheistic faiths, but there also was a large group of dualistic faiths where it wasn't a bunch of gods, it was a good god and an evil god in conflict. And that dualistic purpose seems to be manifest here in Santa Diablada. And then, of course, we have Camino Estelar. So just as the Atacama Desert is used to film Mars shots for Hollywood and test Mars rovers, this area is also used for observation posts to watch the stars, because this is really high up, and so it's sometimes above cloud cover. And so having a religion that specifically focuses on stars, I think makes a lot of sense. And that seems to be what the Camino Estelar faith references. But it's important to note that if you're playing as a Hoihepunko character, you can actually make decisions to either break off from the Inti hierarchy or affirm unity with the Inti hierarchy. And so there's some really interesting choices that the game already makes available to you as characters in Tawantinsuyu. And so I think if you want to have a really fun time in CK3 after the end, load up as one of these characters. They're going to have partially randomized personalities and abilities, but I've never seen a role between Empress Cusi, Francisca, Maria, King Juan Carlos, or even Duke Martin, where I didn't see one character who looked like they would be a lot of fun to play in this Civil War. Or you can even play a character just looking to use the Civil War to break free. That's our bookmark here for Tawantinsuyu, the Empire in the Clouds. I think up next we're probably going to look at either Brazil or at Pampa. All right, that's Walker. Take care.